information, I think, is the ultimate battering ram that's going to break through these walls of silo. We have departments in some more sophisticated organizations today that, BI, business intelligence. The social media is sort of outside those walls. Let's talk a little bit about whether or not business intelligence should start to extend what it is looking at, or if this is going to become one of those outside-in types of things where it's going to have to be brought up through marketing or through service or what have you. Kind of playing off the whole idea of analysis paralysis, where there's almost this fear of too much information.
But I have very complex thoughts about business intelligence. I think there's a fundamental shift going on in the world in which business intelligence is moving away from the old model in which people study reports, even kind of reports that you could build with something like People Browser, and then make decisions, to one in which you use analytic tools to build algorithms so that your organization responds automatically and does the right thing. And that's sort of the cutting edge. But I think that we need to as organizations be moving more towards autonomic responses to what we see and hear. And that's kind of further out along the curve, I know, for many people. But it's really, we're gonna have to get beyond BI. The example I use of this is Google, who is really on the cutting edge still, despite not being quite the darling of the valley that they once were. When you think about how they do search quality, for example, it's not like somebody sitting there going, ooh, that's a lousy search result, let's push this one up. They say, ooh, that's a lousy search result. How do we have to tweak the algorithm so it doesn't show up anymore? And that kind of thinking is really going to penetrate even, I think, into social media. It's sort of like we're going to actually be modifying what we do so that we get different results, rather than kind of studying it and responding on a one-by-one basis.
So if I could add to that, Brian, I think that what Google and Microsoft Bing are doing at the moment is completely upside down when it comes to social search. This is not about taking PageRank search and then mixing some tweets in, which is what we're seeing at the moment. Where I think the consumer wants this to go, and in a few years, I hope it's in this place, you post a search query and you see first what your friends are saying, then what people in your community are saying, then what people in San Francisco are saying, and then maybe you mix some PageRank in amongst down near the bottom. And so I think that where search is going is completely the reverse of what we're actually seeing now on Google. And it's a big call, but I think they've taught us to search, and now we're learning about friends, location, interest graphs, and community, and search is going to be turned upside down over the next few years.
Yeah, I have sort of a radical view on this, which is that I think the social graph and the interest graph will converge. And here's an example. I was on a panel this morning with 3 women from Moxie, Polyvore, and ModCloth talking about fashion and social. And Polyvore is this community of women who basically become fashion editors in their own right. They go to the Polyvore site, it's an e-commerce site, they look at items of clothing, accessories, etc., and they create their own fashion editorial, they create their own looks. And then people start to follow them. So, I don't know about you, but when I go shopping, I love my friends, but I don't necessarily rely on them for style advice. Some more than others, right? And I revere Robert Scoble, but I wouldn't necessarily ask him whether these pants look good on me and stuff. So the Polyvore model is really interesting because you have this community of affinity, right? It is an interest graph. But the women from Polyvore this morning told this fantastic story about how these women now are starting to connect with each other on the site and actually go to fashion week together. And so what's happened is that the interest graph has become a social graph. And this is also true with the mommy bloggers, by the way, I'm a recovering mommy blogger myself, who connect with each other around conditions, around issues around child raising and things like that. And then in some very real cases become friends. And so I think, when we look at it in a binary way, either interest or social, we're kind of missing what happens contextually in that process. And it gets very complicated there, and I don't know you know, I'm not an algorithm person, so I don't know how that's gonna work, but I do see it kind of.
A great post by Fred Wilson recently about, actually there's another one by John Patel too, I'm kind of remembering too. Really this idea of sort of meta services, because really you want tools that would let you, you know, look at your social graph in each of these services and say, oh yeah, I follow these people here for this, and I follow these people over here for that, and I follow these people over here for that. And right now, we don't really have good tools for managing across services, and I think that is the next way of coming.
It's one of the promises actually for Facebook groups, right? Because I think sociologists will say that in real life you have 4 to 6, maybe as many as 10 distinct networks with very little overlap. So how we network today is not at all how we network in the real
Well,
life.
sorry, just for a little bit of historical perspective, Aristotle said it's only possible to have one friend.
That's quote of the night.
How many people have seen that episode of South Park where that individual only has one friend? Very wonderful story.
I just want to comment on something that Susan said about the social graph, interest graph. I don't think it's a matter of social graph or interest graph. I think that there's no doubt that we're going to end up with an interest graph that contains our friends' data. But more importantly, the focus is going to shift to what interests us today. I think that's the key. And friends will be part of it, as will strangers, and we'll be able to authenticate strangers. I think that's the gold standard. How do we authenticate strangers? The reason that we go to friends first is we know who they are. But for the interest graph to gain momentum, we need to be able to rapidly authenticate people whose tweets we don't know.
But I'll also say that one thing that makes us call someone a friend is that we have some overlapping interests, such that when they tell us, hey, this is cool, we're likely to agree. And somebody who is not a friend might say, oh, this is cool, and you go, oh God, they've got to be kidding.
So we only like people who agree with us.
No, it's not agree with us. I think it's actually, the ideal friend has a degree of difference such that you see things you would never have seen or come across yourself. They extend you.
And add value to our ideas.
That's right.
Or they
Somebody's
complete
here in the audience looking big.
All right, just a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up to you folks. All right, so Tim, Jody, Susan, I'm sure you've all seen in your research and just even through day-to-day experience, and quite honestly, businesses are run quite from a very efficient operationalization standpoint, where this type of data really starts to threaten how even the very nature of businesses work on a daily basis. And Tim, you brought up something earlier, Jody, which you continued on, is this idea of authority as well as algorithms. How do you see businesses sort of scaling the amount of information that comes into the organization? Jody, you mentioned something as many as 2 million brand mentions a day. We've heard a little bit of this social customer hierarchy, where maybe businesses will only pay attention to those individuals who have a iPhone next to their mic. Where those individuals have maybe pay attention to those who have a higher clout score than others because of the propensity or the likelihood for that individual to make waves. How does
So
it
clout, is that some kind of cleanser?
It got the stain out.
It's an attention cleanser.
So
It's an attention cleanse. It's good, actually.
where I think where I
That's
think influence has to evolve to is influence has to evolve to be product or community specific, and where I think the social data has to end up, it has to be merged with the company's data. So, for example, airlines, when you take a call center call, you need to see the frequent flyer number and the frequent flyer level of that person who's making the incoming call, and their influence, not just generally. So take Huffington Post, for example. Huff have done a great job integrating Twitter. They've done a nice job integrating Clout. And when you looked up Egypt last week, you saw a Clout score, but that Clout score was not an influence based on Egypt. And it should be. And that's where influence needs to evolve to. And so businesses need to be integrating their metadata, like frequent flyer, plus influence scores that are relative to their community.
I agree with you to some extent, but I worry a little bit that by paying attention only to people with big influence scores, we miss a really important point. I want to pay attention to somebody who tells me something interesting and true, and they may have zero influence until the time that they tell me.
That's great.
That's right.
That's great.
I
Bravo.
would also go back to a point you made, Brian, about what happens to business when you start listening. So, one of the things that we're starting to see happen now is a lot of call centers that are starting to integrate listening into the call center. This is very, very hard because call centers, how are they rewarded? Number of calls they take.
Sorry, smelled good.
It's your fault, Brian. I'll be over
At least I
here.
can do it. So here's the thing, call centers.
Give him a good clap around the ears for that.
Call centers are rewarded for how fast they can finish the transaction. That's not so social, right? So if we're going to start to take this seriously and change the way that we treat customers, then we have to think really carefully about what that call center becomes. Are they just simply going to continue as a transactional place that says scratch? Okay, take care of the scratch and on your way. Or are they going to have to partner with another group to start to think about the implications of the scratch? You know, are they going to have to partner with market research to start to aggregate up the number of scratches in product development? I mean, and those are that's the sort of ligaments of the new business that are going to have to start to grow. And that's the hardest thing because that involves actual people communicating with each other.
I think the volume and reach of these conversations that are taking place are going to shake the very foundation of business, right? And I believe that leadership is something that has to be earned. It's not just something that we can take for granted. And with this listening, with the collective intelligence that's out there, we actually have the ability to adapt, to continually earn relevance, and to re-earn that leadership every day. Tim, you had a great conversation with Gary Hamel. I hope I said his last name correctly. He's actually, he wrote a book that I loved back in the day named Competing for the Future. And he talked about this idea of businesses succumbing to the second law of thermodynamics. How I remembered that. But basically, they lose their sense of direction. They lose this momentum. They succumb to the everyday aspects of just being a business. And I thought about that conversation you had in tonight's conversation, about that being the very thing that could reinvigorate a company is insight, information, the ability to earn relevance. And you had some great answers and wanted you to share those with us.
Boy, that would require me to remember what I said some months ago. And you know, for me, a conversation is triggered by its occasion, and I, quite frankly, can't remember what I told Gary.
It was good. So what do you think?
So we can go back and look at the video then.
But the idea of just intelligence sort of reinvigorating the organization, I mean, do you see that as feeding in, as being a source of inspiration?
Well, you know, it's very, very clear that a successful organization really has two aspects. One, it is good at listening. It takes in a lot of input from its environment. At the same time, it's not this kind of mindless whack-a-mole kind of listening that you see, I think, a lot of people imagining when they think about you know, social media and what are customers saying about them and about their brand. You know, it's not formulaic. You know, when a great company listens, they hear what people are really saying, and they think about what those thoughts of other people make them think. You know, it's not just sort of like, oh, bang, bang, yeah, we got to respond to that, we got to respond to that. When I, you know, get ideas from my customers, it's very rarely the idea as presented. It is the idea as it sparks, you know, new directions in me. You know, when you're really having a conversation, the sum, the output, the result is nonlinear. And you know, I think, you know, our goal in engaging in deeper conversations with our market is actually to spark our own best thinking, to have thoughts that we didn't have before. And so I guess I would just say that, you know, in an organization, you do have this tendency to get bogged down, you know, by inertia, by your heritage and history. And getting fresh input from the market can reinvigorate you, but only if you allow it to spark your own creativity and remind you of what you once knew.